Hi, I'm Nuno, the Corsair, and this is 90 Days of DevOps. Today it's a bit special. Let's take a little bit back on what you saw so far during all these days and think it about the environment itself, and more specifically, as you can see on the screen right now, on Windows. So all the projects might be either on cloud, so you might have some clients to connect to, or they could be on your local machine if you are developing, for example. And in this case, you might want to have a local development environment fully set up. Now, if you look attentively of the other days, potentially you will see a lot of Mac or Linux desktops. This is due to the fact that containers are exclusively almost done over Linux. So whenever you need some tooling around your container life cycle, for example, your creation and so on of containers, then you might need to have a Linux as this position. On Windows, well, it's not Linux first. And then what you can have is the WSL, so the Windows subsystem for Linux. We will see that during this video, how to set up it, configure it a little bit, and mainly how you can use the tools that you have seen so far during all the days of the 90 Days of DevOps in this community edition 2024 or the previous ones, and how you can potentially use them on your own Windows environment. To start, let's see this desktop. On this desktop, it's not an exclusive set of tools, that's important to know, but it's also like the main ones, the more common ones that you might see or even need to use at your workplace or while you're learning. On the left side, for example, we will have Visual Studio Code. Then we have something called Git Bash, and we'll see what it is and how it differs from WSL itself, but it's really useful, so it's good to know. Then we have GitHub Desktop. Myself, I like command line. However, GitHub Desktop is a visual tool that will help us also. So if you're starting to learn Git, or if you're starting to know how to contribute to some open source projects, you might want to have helpers. GitHub Desktop is a great one, and we will see how. On the lower part, it's a bit tricky. It's new tools, and even if you see Notepad there, but it's new tools that Microsoft is creating to help the developers out there. Don't get me wrong, you might not use it as often as Visual Studio Code, but it's always good to know that you have this possibility. Then DevHome and Winget UI, tools that are mainly targeted at a developer audience by default, and also Winget. We will have a look that is a bit more in depth, because we need to understand what Winget is and how you can use it and leverage it to your daily work. On the right side, you will see a set of tools that are container oriented. So we have Rancher Desktop, Podman Desktop, Docker Desktop, and Finch. We will see potentially what are the main difference between those. Right now, I will tell you, there's no perfect choice. The perfect choice is the one that will serve you the most. We will see the differences between these four tools, but the goal is really for you to have just an idea of what these tools are doing. They overlap a lot, so don't get frustrated about choosing one perfect. You might have to change it. Here I have the four of them, so we'll see. Last but not least, here is WSL distro. In this case, I'm using Tumbleweed. There's no there's no perfect choice. There's no, it's just really a matter of taste and a matter of knowledge. A lot of us will use Ubuntu. A lot of others might use maybe Arch Linux, why not? Or Fedora, for example. So there's tools or distros at least that are targeted at WSL specifically, and others that are ported with everything that you know about Linux or the distro itself, that you might be able to reuse on WSL. Okay, so that's quite the small intro. We will start first with what I call the Windows native applications. So the first tool, of course, will be the terminal. So this terminal here is called the Microsoft Terminal, is available to download via the Windows App Store, or you have the ability to actually download it directly from GitHub. It's an open source project, more aligned with the modern terminals that you can see on Linux or macOS. In this case, as you can see, I have tabs. It can create a new pane. I can close it. And then the most important one is that I have different profiles. So from here, I can run directly, for example, command prompt, and you can use some tools like the Azure Cloud Shell, for example. So if you have an account and you use the Azure CLI on a daily basis or a weekly basis, let's say on your work or while you're learning, then you have the Azure Cloud Shell directly from here. So I will just run it. I will not go through the whole process, but here you can see I can enroll this environment, and then once I've done it, I will have access to the Azure Cloud Shell directly into my account on Azure. Of course, if you do have something like Amazon or Google Cloud and you need the CLIs, then you can always install the CLI and then adapt the terminal. But we will not see this here today. Another part here, what I said is that there's some settings, and these settings I will let you go through, but here the most important one is, like, for example, you can see the profile. Here you can see that the window has some transparency effect. That's from the settings. You can set some background, for example. You can change the font, for example, if you need ligatures that you can install on Windows and then reuse them on the terminal, and so on and so forth. And then you can see all the different profiles that are installed by default or that I installed afterwards once I installed the terminal. The second tool that I really want you to know about is Winget. So I will just type Winget here. This PowerShell version is PowerShell 7, as you can see, or PWSH. And it has some really great feature, which is like the most common used commands. It will suggest them to me. So as you can see, there's something that I was doing before about one import, but don't mind it for now. We'll just look at the Winget commands, and here are the options. So let me put it bigger and bigger here. What we can do with Winget is like a normal Linux package manager, for example, or if you are using Mac, you can use Brew, and then Winget will be the same in terms of package management. So you can install packages, you can do other things like show the package information or look at the source, and then we can search for certain packages and so on, and then you can uninstall, and I will let you discover, but just think that Winget is here to help you. If we do a Winget search, even just code, if we look at code, these options are packages that I can install or we can install into our computer. The good point is that there's a lot already made by either the community or, for example, by the vendors themselves who are populating the Winget repository more and more. To get access to the repository, again, it's an open source, it's on GitHub, and all the links will be down below in the video. So here, I already installed it, but let's assume that I want to install Visual Studio Code from the first time on my computer. I will say I want to install and Microsoft Visual Studio Code, which was the ID of the package. It will tell me that it's already installed, and that's it. But that's how you will install it. So Winget will really help you to get almost all the applications that you might need. And the most important part, as you could see before when I was typing, there's an import. And here I created a file with several applications, and you will find those into a GitHub repository that you will find also down below in the link. So once that we have our terminal and our applications installed, the next thing we want to do potentially is to start to code. So the next tool is Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code is becoming, if not already, the default IDE for a lot of developers around the world. They are creating plugins that will help you also. But here, I will not explain too much about Visual Studio Code. I will let you download it and test it by yourself. Just mind there's some extensions, and the most known on Windows might be the dev containers, the GitHub code spaces, or the WSL1, and this one we will see a little bit later on. These plugins here allow you to open directly a connection to a certain environment. So here let me show you how you can use the remote. If you look here on the small icon on the lower left part, you have an open remote window. And if we click on it, then you will have several options. A connection to the WSL distro, and then we have something like containers, so dev containers. A really good tool that I will suggest you strongly to have a look on the dev containers. Really cool tool. But that's something that you can use directly from Visual Studio Code as the plugin. Then you can also connect directly to a code space or create a new code space on GitHub directly. This will allow other developers to connect to your code space and have the environment that you pre-installed for your application. Finally, there's others that you can install. So SSH, for example. So if you have a local development server or a machine that several persons can connect through SSH from Visual Studio Code, you will be able to install the SSH plugin and then connect remotely to this environment, and so you can continue developing there. That is Visual Studio Code. So that mainly like the same if you are using it on Mac or Linux anyway, with the exception that you have the connection to WSL. So once we have Visual Studio Code and you coded your application, there's Git. So here, Git bash is something that is what we call a translation layer, where you are not into a Linux, even though you think you might be. So I can do an ls instead of dir, and then it will list something. Mind that I'm in my home directory, and this home directory is my Windows home directory. So that's what I mean by layer. What we can do, however, from here is that we can use the pipes and grep, for example, for video, and then we'll only see the video directory. So that's a place where you can use most of the, let's say, the standard commands. So now the most important part is that we have access to Git by default. And so if you need to git pull, git clone, or do any other commands with Git, you can have it directly from here. Even better, when you have git bash, if I go back to PowerShell now, I can also use Git from here because it will recognize that I have Git installed. The Windows native Git application. That's important. Just a small parenthesis, if you are not fond or if you are learning about Git, then there's GitHub Desktop. GitHub Desktop is something that I actually use on my daily work, and for me it's really a good helper. It's visual. We can almost do everything that you can do with Git, almost. Sometimes you might go to the Git command to perform some tasks, but other than that, believe me, GitHub Desktop is a time saver, first because I don't have to remember all my Git commands and so on, and it has a really nice UI. So as you can see, this is the first time I'm connecting. So let's sign it, and then it will open a web page. It recognizes me because I was already connected to GitHub before. It will recognize who I am, and then I just have to press finish, and finally it will come here. And like I said, I will turn this repo afterwards to something that is public, but you will have access also to the repo. But let's actually clone this repo already. We will clone it. There's no files in it. Believe me, there's just the repo out. The files are being prepared. But from here, I can finally use my environment. Actually, my Git environment is already set up for me. And now, if I want to open the Git repo into Visual Studio Code, I can. Here we go. Okay, I will trust the author. And like I said, there's no files for now. Everything will be prepared for you. Here, you can already see the applications made it that they are connected to one and the other. So if we come back to actually the desktop right now, you can tell that your environment with these different tools here, they are connected, and they will be connected with Rancher Desktop or Docker Desktop in this case, or they will be connected to WSL. And that's why when you are using Windows, you really need to understand that you gain a lot of power by having different tools and these different tools being interconnected. I will not enter into all the tools that I have here, but I would like to see WSL. So here I'm launching the OpenSUSE Tumbleweed distribution, and now I do have a Linux userland that is actually virtualized and integrated with Windows, but it's no more a translation layer like the Git bash that we had before. Now, if I do an ls, I am inside my home, inside my distribution. One of the strengths of WSL is the possibility to be connected to Windows. And here you can see that I'm listing the C drive through a mount point, and I can see my files and directories that are on Windows side. So now that's where we need to be really careful, and that's maybe the first tip that I will provide you. Before, we did a git clone and I did it on the Windows side. However, when working with WSL, because I'm jumping into another file system, which is the Windows file system, and I'm adding that into the Windows file system while working on WSL, I will hit some performance issue. That's something that is really known right now. So the very important tip that I can tell you is that work on WSL file system when using WSL, and you can use tools like Visual Studio Code. So now let's say that I do want to create a file called 90 days from WSL.yaml. Okay, if I do that, look what it will happen. Thanks to Visual Studio Code and extension that I installed prior, here I'm opening the 90 days from WSL.yaml file that is actually located inside WSL. And if I do video and I just save it, now I can come back to WSL, and if I get 90 days, I will have my file edited directly from Visual Studio Code, which is the native application on Windows, but it's targeting WSL in the backend. So you can see the connectivity again between the tools. Okay, so now we even added another layer, which is WSL. Finally, because DevOps nowadays tend to have a lot of containers, you have different choices. You can use Rancher Desktop, which will bring you an environment with Kubernetes and two types of container runtimes that you can choose between one of the other. And you can enable or disable also Kubernetes. The next one is Podman Desktop. Podman Desktop, like Rancher Desktop or Docker Desktop, allows you to run containers and also has plugin modes, and you can run OpenShift, for example, if you are using that at your work. And again, these two tools, Rancher Desktop, Podman Desktop, and actually the other two also, but for now these two, will create another distro inside WSL. So here, if I come back to PowerShell and I do a WSL list verbose, you'll see that I have my distribution that I'm running. So that's the one that I choose to work from. But then I do have the Docker Desktop, I do have the Podman machine, and I do have the Rancher Desktop also. So these distributions, however, you can consider them like appliances, and they are in some sense ephemeral. So it means that every change that you will want to do inside these distributions, first, it's not really recommended, but then you will lose them also. The third tool is Docker Desktop. So now Docker Desktop was the first of these applications to be created by Docker, and these actually opened the world to these container applications, and we cannot be thankful enough to what they did, because thanks to them they really pioneered these applications that we can use today. Then came Rancher Desktop, Podman Desktop, and most recently Finch. The last tool is Finch. Finch has been created by the AWSL team, and it shares a lot of tooling with Rancher Desktop. It's based on nerdctl, it's based on containerd. However, something that they use into macOS is Lima, which is a tool like WSL if you want, but for macOS. And in this case, their work was to port Lima into Windows and using WSL2 as the driver to create a distro for Finch. This is redundant maybe for someone, but in my opinion, it will be really important because now the skill set on Lima on how to create these different environments, now they can be shared across platform. And of course, in terms of development, if you are creating something around containers and you are using Lima for Mac or for Linux, now potentially your tool can also run into Windows. So that's why I'm listing this one here, because it's a bit special for the future. But nowadays you can already run it and you can use it directly. So this concludes the talk on DevOps on Windows for the 90 Days of DevOps Community Edition. I hope you actually are curious now to deep dive a bit more into Windows and the tools that are provided nowadays. So stay tuned, continue learning, and see you out there. Thank you.